Hey everybody, welcome to Writers in Process. I'm interviewing Mary Morris today, which I'm thrilled about. Mary most recently published The Jazz Palace and Gateway to the Moon, and we're here to talk about new work that she's doing now. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Nice to be here.
Good. So I wondered, at what point in your process did you start working on a new book? Was it like...
Well, no, actually, that's a really great question for me right now because, well, first of all, I spent 17 years on the Jazz Palace, which was a huge historical novel that I studied jazz for 4 years to try to, it was a really big project, and I didn't want to do another historical novel. Then I did Gateway, and that was another historical novel. And then I said, I'm really done. I'm done with it. Like, I wasn't going to do another book like that. And after I published Gateway, which is about the Inquisition and the secret Jews of New Mexico, a friend who's Jamaican called me and said, oh, you've got to meet this guy named Gary, because Gary's doing all this work on the restoration of Jewish cemeteries in Jamaica. And I said, I'm not interested in cemeteries. I don't want to do any history. And I'm saying this as a Jewish person. I'm done writing about Jews. I don't want to do it anymore. And anyway, long story short, Gary introduced me to a man named Ainsley Cohn Enriquez. Ainsley is a descendant of the Jewish pirate, Moses Cohn Enriquez. And once I learned about that, I read a book called Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean.
Oh, that's awesome.
Now, I wasn't going to do this. I was just curious. It wasn't going to happen. But long story short, I found a lot of interfaces between the history of Jamaica and the Jewish pirates, and a lot of material about Jamaica. And now I'm doing the sequel to Gateway. That was a long answer to your question, but
wonderful answer to my question. So at what point were you finished with Gateway and turned it in, and then you started this project, or did it overlap at all?
Well, so in terms of process, so when I was finishing Gateway and I was really in the last crunch, I put out on social media, I need a place to go. It's got to be quiet. I don't want anyone to bother me, blah, blah, blah. And there were a lot of responses. But I have a friend who runs a hotel in Manhattan called the Kimberly. And she said, Mary, come to the Kimberly. So the person who runs the Kimberly is my Jamaican friend who, so I was working on Gateway, finishing Gateway at the hotel, and my friend was already talking to me about these Jamaican cemeteries that I wasn't interested in and I wasn't going to write about. And now I'm not only am I writing about it, but it's like all I can do. So I'm
right. So at what point did you decide that you would write about it?
Okay. I was at a Rasta bar in Cozumel. At the very tip of Cozumel, there's a bar called Freedom in Paradise. It's totally Jamaican. And my husband was going for a 10-mile run, and I was lying in a hammock listening to Bob Marley with a bottle of Red Stripe, reading Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. And I got to a passage that talked about how the Columbus family had controlled Jamaica for 100 years, and the Inquisition never came to Jamaica. And I'm lying in this hammock in Cozumel listening to Bob Marley, and I said, this is my next book. So it was like a lightning bolt. Essentially, it was a lightning bolt.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, except there was no lightning.
But you knew it was meant to be, and there was Red Stripe, which is important.
And I was drinking the Red Stripe, and I'm in the hammock, and I'm listening to Bob Marley, and I thought, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to write about Jamaica. And then all of a sudden, literally joking aside, I began to see how the Columbus family, because I did tremendous Columbus research for Gateway, how the Columbus family interfaces with this story. And the more I learned about Jamaica, and one of the things I learned that makes it is a difficult story is the relationship between essentially Jewish merchants who bought and sold slaves and slave culture. So that really has, and the more I got into that, the more I felt that there's this story here. So I think it's actually going to be a trilogy.
Fantastic.
I think so. But going again about process, it was, it was a little like falling in love. It's a moment like, no, I don't want I don't have time to fall in love. I don't have time. I don't want to do this. And then, anyway, here I am. And my editor bought it. She bought it on a proposal. So in fact,
fantastic.
unlike the Jazz Palace and unlike Gateway, I actually have a job to do. Like I actually have to get up and work,
That's fantastic. I love
it's good. It's good. I like it. Yeah.
So do you find it difficult to transition from the prose of Gateway to the Moon to like this new project and developing the prose? Is there, or even mentally the transition? How's that?
I mean, every book, it is a kind of love affair. You are passionately involved in something. You live it and think it, and it takes you over. And when it's over with, there's a sense of loss. For every book you finish, there's a sense of loss, and you feel like, oh, that's never going to happen to me again. I'm never going to have that, that moment where something grabs me. And as the Jamaica thing started to come to me, I think what's been the most daunting about it is every book I've written, I've had some personal connection. So the Jazz Palace is about Chicago, and I grew up there, and my father was an amateur jazz musician. So I could draw a lot from that part of my life. Or in Gateway, we lived in New Mexico for a year, and I had a lot of journals and I had a lot of notes. So I knew that world. I knew about rattlesnakes and some of those other things that I wrote about. Mm-hmm. Jamaica, I mean, there's fruit that grows on the trees that like I've never seen before. There are things that are just and the culture itself is a very complicated, very politically complicated, socially complicated. It's such a multi-layered culture that it's very hard to penetrate. Not to mention the fact that a very, very large percentage of the population speaks patois,
right?
Which is very hard to understand. And I'm not Marlon James. I didn't grow up in that culture. I'm not going to write a brief history of 7 killings because he hears that language because he grew up with that language. So a lot of the challenge has been, how do I have, because I have certain African American characters as I did in the Jazz Palace, how do they talk, how can they talk without it feeling like cultural appropriation, really, which is something I feel very sensitive about. I will tell you one kind of funny little thing. So Ainsley Cohn Enriquez, descended from Jewish pirates, has a lovely daughter named Anna, who's become a really good friend. And Anna read Gateway and she said, I loved it, I loved it, I loved it, but there weren't mangoes in the Caribbean at the time of Columbus, there were pineapples. And I was like, oh dear. So I had to go back, and for the next editions, mangoes had to become pineapples. And that's just a small example of how deep you have to know the culture to know that mangoes were actually brought by Captain Bligh in the 1700s, and what, so there's a lot. There's the language, the politics, the levels of poverty. Why is Jamaica so impoverished? Why that history of violence? And
what's your research like? How do you go about getting yourself so deeply into this world?
Well, so this odd thing I found with the books that I work on, and this is one of them. Somehow doors seem to, if I am attached to a project, suddenly doors seem to open to people who can be my guides, essentially, show me the way. And I've met a tremendous number of people along the way who've been really helpful. I've gotten to be very close to the woman she's a historian who runs the Jewish cemetery in Falmouth, Jamaica, and is documenting the very complex history of that cemetery and the people who were buried there and so on and so forth. So I found guides along the way. I will read anything that someone tells me to read. I don't know. I've always found that people are willing to open up and be, one of the first short stories I ever wrote was about a girl at a swim club, and there are 2 lifeguards, and one is very cute and he's a high diver and the other's very nerdy. and she's going to fall in love with him. It's a first love story, right?
Mhm.
And I thought, well, diving was going to be important, but I didn't know anything about diving. So I called Columbia University's swim department and I asked to talk to the diving coach. And he told me all kinds of things about diving. And so I guess I learned early on. I mean, I'm not afraid to ask questions.
Mhm.
I'm not afraid someone says no. It doesn't bother me that much. So I just kind of plow into it, you know, for better or for
Fantastic.
worse. But particularly with the Jamaica book, I just keep finding these layers of people opening up to me in really, really interesting ways. So
That's great. Do you, so once you're sort of in the zone with the book, how do you develop the narrative arc? Like, is that something that comes to you as you're writing the first draft, or is it something you're plotting out ahead of time? How does that work?
well, okay. I don't write in order. So I write the scenes that pop into my head, and I don't necessarily know where they're going to go or when they're going to go anywhere, and I don't really worry about it that much. So, for example, with Gateway, I had many pieces of narratives, and my husband and I do house swaps with this family in Italy, and they have a farm, and there's an old cow barn, and in the cow barn there's a ping pong table, and when we go there, I put my manuscript all over the ping pong table and I move the pages around because it's really big. And I've also found that the map room at the New York Public Library is a good place to, they're big tables and I can move pieces around. So I don't really write in order. So, you know, for example, I don't want to give too much away about Gateway, but there is a big reveal about Miguel in the novel. And I didn't know what his personal story was until I wrote the scene quite late in the book and quite late in the process. In fact, my editor wanted me to take the character of Elena out of the book because she says, I don't know why the ant's in the book. The ant doesn't seem to matter in the book. And it took me a long time. So in other words, I don't really know the story
Right.
moving forward. It reveals itself to me, hopefully, or not.
Right.
You know, you hope, right?
So how do your characters come to you in terms of like, do they come in an image or a voice?
Well, okay, so sometimes, you know, I'm a storyteller, not a historian, right? I always want
Mhm.
to make that distinction when I'm talking about sort of historical fiction. And um, in terms of the new novel, which is called Flame of the Forest, it'll be published in 2021, um, I had an idea for a female character um, who, when her father dies, she uh, puts him in her pickup truck and drives him down to Kingston to bury him in the Jewish cemetery in Kingston. And I wanted this character to literally physically carry her father in her pickup truck and drive him down. That was a tidbit that somebody told me that their great aunt had done. And so
Mm.
I said, may, and they said, yes, you can have that. Now I knew that I wanted, okay, maybe it's because I'm left-handed. I just don't do anything in a very straight line. I'm not very linear. And I knew that this female character was going to have some kind of relationship with someone descended from slaves, someone descended from Africans. And I was struggling with it, and, you know, again, the cultural appropriation thing. And when I go down to Jamaica, I stay at a hotel that my Jamaican friend in New York has put me in touch with people in this hotel. So they're very nice to me there, and it's very easy for me to be there. And one day I was sitting outside and I was struggling, and this very nice young man, a server came and, you know, do you have everything? Is everything good? And I said, yes. And I looked up and his name tag said Thunder.
Oh, that's
And I just said, I didn't say out loud, I said, you're going in my book, Thunder. So now Thunder, and I said to him jokingly, I said, so do you have a sister named Lightning? He said, no, my brother is named Lightning.
Oh my gosh.
And that was it. You know, Thunder has a sister in the novel named Lightning. And the new novel is a lot about siblings. I write a lot about siblings. My brother always calls me up and says, so am I a drug dealer this time? Am I dead? Am I alive? Am I in a motorcycle accident? No. So the minute I saw his name, Thunder, I thought that's it, Thunder. And so he grew out of that, you know.
That's cool. So
Yeah.
is your writing going back over stuff? What's your process like for revision? How do you tackle that?
Right. So um, well, I'll tell you my favorite thing to do. My favorite thing is to print out the whole manuscript. Like right now, for example, I'm working towards finishing a draft, not a draft, but I'm revising what I have so far. I have about half the book, I think. I'm going to Park City, Utah next week to give a talk. And I have 2 long flights and a long day in Park City. And I'm going to print out the draft and sit on the plane and sit in my hotel room and read the thing through as if someone else wrote it. And
Okay.
that's the key for me. I try to look at it and think, this isn't mine. There's a friend over there who asked me to read this, and I'm reading it for a friend, and how does it hold up? I can't edit in my house. I can revise. A lot of times I will pack everything up in a backpack and go to the New York Public Library and sit in the Rose Reading Room and work there. But I can't do it here in my office, even though I have a lovely office. And but I can, I can type and put things into the computer, but I can't, so I have to actually physically take hard copy somewhere else from home and find a place where I can be quiet and no one will bother me.
Right. So you've written a bunch of books. Do you find that when you're writing a new novel, there are things you've learned as you've gone along with each book that help you with the new novel, or is it all just the whole?
Totally. No, totally. And that I think, there's a definite learning curve. I remember reading once that if you put 3 dolphins in a pool and you teach the first dolphin how to do something, the other dolphins will learn more quickly because they're listening, they're paying attention. And I feel like I feel like a serial dolphin, like I'm always learning. One of the things I learned, I spent so long on the Jazz Palace, 17 years, which was crazy. But when I wrote Gateway, I could be much more economical, and I could say much more quickly, that's going to work, that's not going to work, I'm not going to, and also with this new novel, I feel like I learned a lot from Gateway in order to, for example, writing the long historical chapters is very daunting. And one of the things I learned is, don't worry about what they eat. Don't worry about what they eat or what they're wearing in the 17th century. Don't worry about if there were windows. Like I've been worrying a lot about windows because I don't know when windows. So, what can you gaze out of a window? Like, in 16th century Spain, what. So I put those things aside and I just try to tell the story and sit with the story as long as I can. And that was also something I learned, not to sweat the details going in. Just get your story down, and then you can figure out who wore a tunic,
Right.
things like that. So a lot of it for me is really trusting yourself enough to tell the story and not worry about all of those other things, because that's what readers read for anyway. That's what I read for.
For the story.
Yeah, unless something's really egregious, like really crazy mistake. Yeah, I'm reading for the story.
So do you read fiction while you're at work on a novel?
Yes, almost exclusively.
Oh, cool. So
No, I just lied. That was a lie. When I'm working on a novel, I'm reading extensive sort of research, but then I also read a lot of fiction. But it has to somehow pertain to what I'm doing. I'm not good at reading sort of, if people say, oh my God, I just read so-and-so's book, and I'm like, well, I'll read it when I'm not,
Right.
Like for the new novel, the Jamaican novel, I'm reading a lot of Marlon James. He has an incredible early book called The Book of Night Women that was very helpful to me. High Wind in Jamaica. I'm reading Mutiny on the Bounty because
I love those books.
yeah, because a lot of Mutiny on the Bounty has to do with Jamaica because it has to do with Redford. So things like that. But I might not read the latest, contemporary novel if it doesn't. It has to feed me in some way.
So what you choose, does it have to feed you in terms of content, or is it like technique and writerly things like that?
Well, that's interesting. part of it is content, but for example, two novels that really are helping me with the Jamaica book. One is Pachinko, that I loved, and I'm rereading it now. I read it on my Kindle, but I'm rereading it now in a paperback, because she so convincingly moves through the years and so seamlessly. And I'm looking at that book, like how she did that.
Mhm.
And another one is Homegoing, which is about Ghana and the slave trade, and that moves back and forth between the lives of two half sisters. And this novel moves back and forth between generations of a brother and a sister. So, to see how people, those books have been sort of Bibles to me. Every time I'm working on a book, there are certain books that become important. Yes.
So what does a good writing day look like for you?
Oh, like today, let's see. Well, I have a big dog, and he needs an hour walk in the morning. So I'm usually up by 8 and have him out and about, and I'm back home by 9 or 9:30. And then my husband goes to work at noon. So we usually have some kind of breakfast together or something like that. And then I'll sit down to work around 10. And ideally, I'll work from 10 till 2 or so. Then I'll go for a swim. And then I'll either come back to my desk and do a little more work, or I'll take care of correspondence and things like that. But like if 10 to 2 is a good work day for me. After 2, I start to get a little, fuzzy.
Yeah. So do you have any advice for new writers or novelists? Anything you'd like to say?
Well, I think of writing the way I think of dancers. I mean, you have to stretch every day, even if you're not performing. You have to, it's a practice that you can learn and you can improve, but you have to do it like any other practice.
Mhm.
And, one of it is that. Another thing is I think it's really tough out there right now. And I think you have to tell the stories you want to tell and the stories you believe in, and not worry about what the world is going to think while you're writing it. I found that anything that doesn't come right from my heart to the page, it's not going to go to the reader's heart. I have to find my own place inside of me to put it down so that it'll matter to someone else.
Right.
So to really, really focus on the work. And, students who come to me, or kids who come to me, or whatever, young writers, and they're really eager to publish, I think that's getting ahead of themselves. And the ones who succeed are the ones, you do the work. You do the work. Yeah.
That's great. That's a wonderful place to end. I want to thank you, Mary, for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Writers in Process with Mary Morris. Thanks, everyone, for listening in.